sometimes we always think of leadership as the flashy MacArthur, the great orator of Churchill, Roosevelt. But oftentimes it's the leader who's a good manager, in a sense, who just takes what he's given and makes it better and is reliable and makes the people above him successful.
This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam Camp, and I'm your host. And joining me across the table is Dr. Richard Blackaby.
Always a delight to be with you, Sam, especially when you bring your 2-year-old with you.
Yeah, well, I do what I can, you know.
She's already come down into my study and brought a Mickey Mouse for me to have to play with today.
So. Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah.
Well, she's been bringing a doll to her mom lately, and so, oh, you forgot your doll, and so Carrie's had to hold a doll around the house, at least when she's in view of Alice.
Exudes cuteness. So
yeah, she certainly does. But
see if you can segue exuding cuteness with our biography today.
Yeah, well, before we get to that biography, though, what I will say is we, as many who have been listening for a while know, we have a place where we host a bunch of online classes. It's blackabyinstitute.com, and we've got a handful of classes there that you can take them at any time. It's asynchronous learning, so you just sign up and take a class at your own pace. But I wanted to highlight one of those this week as we kind of move into the fall season. We just dropped my oldest off at our first day of kindergarten today, so things are kind of gearing back up for fall.
Yep.
And oftentimes that is when churches will go through our sort of cornerstone study, which is Experiencing God. And that is also one of the studies available at blackabyinstitute.com. And for our listeners, we'll give you 10% off if you just use the code LEADER when you sign up for that class. And you get a coupon is included to purchase the workbook. And one of the many benefits of doing the online class is you get all 3 tapings of the teaching material for Experiencing God. So you kind of have what we call the classic Experiencing God with your dad, Henry, and then we have the revised, which is you and Henry, and then the most recent, the current edition, which is you and your oldest son, Mike.
Yeah.
And so you can have access to all of that, plus some more videos that we recorded just for this online class. But I just wanted to let folks know they can go to blackabyinstitute.com and sign up for that.
It's been life transforming for many millions of people. And so, but it's a great way to do it because you can do it on the fly. You can do it just as you travel or working, or just as you can.
And there's a chat in there as well, so you can ask questions and just talk with other folks who are also doing the study. So just want to make you aware of that before we dive into the great and powerful George C. Marshall, who we probably all know because of his Marshall Plan.
That's right.
But we're going to find out even more about who this 5-star general was.
Yeah, and I think nowadays he's not as well known as he would have been in the 40s and 50s. But one of the few 5-star generals in the U.S. Army. Also, as far as I know, the only Army general ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which, of course, if you're a general, it seems almost counterintuitive to think of you as winning a peace prize.
Yeah.
But he was highly respected in his day. And so I thought we'd just kind of hit a couple of the highlights of his life. And it's based on a biography by Ed Cray that I read a couple of years ago. And I just kept coming across Marshall's name, and so Marshall himself, like a lot of people, when you start out looking at their childhood, you would never guess that they would one day rise to the very top of their field. He grew up relatively poor, a very ordinary child, nothing that really stood out about him, which is always interesting to me. When I read a biography about a great leader, I always like it when they talk a bit about their childhood. There were some that obviously sort of, did some things that alerted you that perhaps they're gonna, they're gonna it sort of foreshadows what they'll be like later. I think Genghis Khan stabbed his brother to death. It's like, well, Napoleon used to organize all the little boys in his neighborhood into huge military conquests, and Churchill used to play with hundreds and hundreds of toy soldiers and all kinds of elaborate formations and strategies, and so there's some times where you look and say, yeah, looking back, there was certainly signs of greatness in this person, but he was quite ordinary. In fact, when he was 9 years old, his dad wanted to get him into a local school, but you had to have an interview, I think, with the principal, just a very rudimentary kind of test, just to find out if he had some basic knowledge, the ABCs and so on. But he kind of clammed up on the interview and failed miserably. It was one of those easy tests that the average child should be able to pass relatively easily, but he failed, and it embarrassed his father. And one of the stories in Marshall's early life is his futile attempt to win his father's approval. And boy, I tell you, you see that a lot with
that's a recurring
great leaders.
theme. Yeah.
And it was as if, I think his dad was one of those guys that just was not great at encouraging his kids anyway. And Marshall just was that kind of kid that seemed to just trip up and fail in his big moments as a child. And so he went through most of his young adult life never having the blessing, the affirmation of his father. And his biographer says that that kind of caused Marshall to dread public failure, public humiliation. He was a guy that became very, very controlled, in large part so that he didn't make big mistakes. And a lot of times that's not a recipe for greatness if you're trying not to fail instead of trying to succeed.
Right.
But Marshall's going to be that kind of guy. And he's also going to have some anger issues, which when you read some of his childhood, you can kind of pick that up. But when he felt like he was being disrespected, treated not properly, that could create great anger in him. And he had a couple of famous kind of outbursts on two occasions with a superior officer that probably should have gotten him stuck and never promoted again. But fortunately for him, he did it with some people who respected people that spoke up. And so had he just been working under someone else at the time, probably we'd never have heard of him. But anyway, so as a 9-year-old, he doesn't do well in school, and later when he's looking to go to get military training, he wants to join the Army, and but he thinks of West Point because of course he wants to be a career officer, a soldier, and so that West Point's the natural choice, but for various reasons, partly just because of his own lack of ability in school, he kind of writes that off. And of course, West Point is kind of famous for producing Army officers, and one of the highest ranking officers of all time didn't even seriously consider it because he didn't think he could do it or get in. And so he goes to Virginia Military Institute, and when he was thinking about going there, his older brother, he overheard a conversation in which his older brother was urging their mother not to let Marshall go to that college because basically he was just considered kind of slow, and the older brother didn't want Marshall to embarrass the family by doing poorly in school. And Marshall happened to hear that, and again was very sensitive to people's opinions of him. It offended him deeply that his older brother, didn't have any confidence in him. And so it's interesting from that beginning how Marshall begins to blossom and grow and gain confidence. And they said that when he first went into school, he was not a very good student. I think his first year he finished like 18th out of 82 students, so he wasn't the worst, but definitely in the lower half, lower quarter. And then he was 19th out of 47, 15th out of 33. He just was very mediocre at best. But along the way, his biographer says he eventually learned how to learn. And of course, learning, like school, there's a way to do school, and some folks just don't ever quite learn that game, and others do. Somewhere along the line, for the most part, I learned how to take tests, and there's a way to do tests, and there's a way not to do tests, and some folks just never learn that. It's not necessarily an intelligence thing. Just a matter of figuring out how to do academics and learn the ropes and how to study and how to stay calm and think through. I grew up with in Canada where most tests were essay questions. There weren't a lot of fill in the blanks, and so you might be given a choice of 2 or 3 essays. Answer one of the following three questions, what it took in part was read each question carefully and then consider, what do you know the most about, and choose the question that will allow you to put forth the most information. And some people just would answer the wrong question and they would get all tangled up, and so he was kind of like that. He just at first he just was a poor student, didn't have confidence, but it's amazing sometimes when a leader starts to have just a little bit of success. And after a bit of success academically, he begins to get some confidence and begins to do better. And so he finally graduates, and Marshall's whole military career is an interesting one. He's a lifer. He's there to have a lifelong career in the military, trying to get as far as he can. And so first thing that happens is he gets shipped off to the Philippines, and basically what Marshall's going to do is he's going to pay his dues. And everywhere he goes, he's going to try to improve things. He's going to try to be efficient. He's going to try to be reliable. And so he just has a number of posts that he goes to, and he spends early on in his career. Of course, when there's not a war going on, promotions come a lot slower. Mm-hmm. There's just not opportunities to advance as much, and so if you want to move up the ladder, up the ranks, it's better in that sense if there's a conflict going on and there's opportunities to prove yourself. But he spends 5 years as a second lieutenant, spends another 9 years as a first lieutenant. There's just looking at his career, he's spending years at the same rank. But what he does do is, in one sense, he becomes something of a military bureaucrat, because he's not leading troops in combat, but he's organizing them. He's developing supply chains. He's coming up with better procedures, being more efficient, and he's the kind of guy that if you're serving under a higher ranking officer, that officer is going to really like having you around, because he can just put Marshall and say, could you get this cleaned up here? Could you find a better process to keep track of inventory or whatever it might be? And he's an organizer, and so he gets to work on that. And interestingly, he's going to become a 5-star general, and he will never actually lead troops in combat. And for the most part, that's really hard to do. If you're not actually in combat zones, it's hard to earn medals. It's hard to prove yourself so that you can, or just be noticed so that you can go up the line. Interestingly, one of his contemporaries is going to be Douglas MacArthur, who also will become a 5-star general. But MacArthur he's always pushing to be out in battle and commanding forces, and so they're going to have kind of a different trajectory. And I think one thing that kind of says to me just about leadership in general is, you may not be trying to achieve higher rank, but there is a secret to just doing your job well, whatever it is. There's always a way to be better organized, more efficient at whatever it is you're in charge of, and that's kind of what he does. There's a couple of times where he actually plans some of the strategies, but he but he doesn't get to actually lead in the actual combat, and so he's a behind the scenes guy, supply trains. He may be even developing strategies for battles, but he's not the one that actually leads. And so he gets to World War I, and again he is not in the actual conflict, although he demonstrates bravery when he can. He actually gets injured at one point while he's scouting out and doing some reconnaissance, but he longs to get that chance to lead in actual combat, to lead in a battle, to prove his mettle, and so in World War I, at a certain point, a commanding the general, in fact, the top U.S. General Pershing, in World War I, at one point comes along and he's asking how things are going, and everybody's kind of telling the general what he wants to hear, and Marshall gets really upset, and his temper kind of comes to a boil, and he just tells Pershing, well, it's not going the way you think it is, and we don't have these supplies, and we're not getting answers in a timely manner to get things done, and we're missing this, we're missing that. And everybody is kind of rolling their eyes thinking, well, Marshall's just kissed his career goodbye. You don't tell the top general in the whole army news like that. But fortunately, Pershing actually thought to himself, finally, I've got someone that will tell me what I want to tell me the truth. And took a real liking, became a father figure, actually, to Marshall. Took him in eventually to be his own personal aide. Which in one sense, that was kind of his curse, was high-ranking folks always liked to have him as kind of a chief of staff, but that meant that he wasn't out there just leading combat troops and things. Everybody wanted him to organize them, and that will be the story of his life and career. But Pershing ends up becoming a good friend of his, and will serve as the best man when he gets married to his second wife after his first wife dies, and so he was that kind of person that he wins some friends, some supporters, which is important, but it's because he's a great second person, a great organizer, and so if you look at his record, wherever he's going, he's making things better, organizing things, being efficient, being reliable. It says that he very much tried to control himself, stay within his limits. Again, he doesn't want to fail, doesn't want to face plant, and so he's somewhat cautious. But if he says he's going to do something, you can take that to the bank. And so eventually, it's approaching World War II, and he has been serving between the world wars in all kinds of posts, staying out of trouble, respecting his superiors, and really through. By the time World War II is approaching, he actually is quoted as saying, "I'm too old now to make it any further in the army. They're going to be looking for younger men than me." But like so many twists of history, it just so happens that the people that know him just know that he's reliable, and we'll have to do a biography sometime on Douglas MacArthur, because the two of them are exact opposites. MacArthur is very prideful, loves to be out front, loves to be in the limelight, and
doesn't he eventually get fired by Truman?
Yeah,
MacArthur?
he does. And Marshall
sort of
is a part of that decision. Ultimately, they didn't like each other; they rubbed each other the wrong way, and so they're always sort of rivals in a sense.
Yeah.
But because of just and then the same thing kind of happens. Marshall is around Franklin Roosevelt when he's the president, and Roosevelt is kind of glibly just holding court, and Roosevelt loved to sort of taunt people, and he was a very powerful man, and he at times would just taunt the military folks, and Marshall doesn't take it very well one day, and his temper gets the better of him, and again he doesn't say anything rude, but he challenges the president and just says your numbers are all wrong. What you're saying is not going to work. Logistically, it's not possible to happen, and we're going to need this, we're going to need that. And then there's this awkward pause. And again, it might mean he's just put the headstone on his career funeral and it's all over. But instead, Roosevelt decides, I like this man. I got to have someone around me that thinks logistically. There are lots of people who have the big ideas, the vision. A lot of times leaders will do that. But
that's sort of the sexy thing, right? Like that's the hot thing to do is, hey, you're a visionary and you can tell a good story, but that means nothing if you can't actually execute.
Right. It's like, okay, we should go ahead and declare war on this enemy, but the marshal would say, well, you're going to need this many tanks, this many planes. You're going to need this kind of supply train and transport vehicles and railroads and factories, and Roosevelt couldn't be bothered with that kind of stuff. But that's the way Marshall's mind thinks. And actually, when World War II broke out, the U.S. Army was actually the 19th largest army in the world. Poland, Bulgaria had a bigger army than the United States did when Marshall first entered the Army, the U.S. had 25,000 soldiers in the entire Army. When he takes over, just in about 1939, just as before the U.S. has entered World War II, they're at like 19th. The Navy is the Air Force. All of it is way below, in the bottom 20. When by the time the war is over, Marshall will have built that up to where there's somewhere like 9 million Americans in the armed forces, and just tens of thousands of planes and ships and submarines and tanks and so on, and vehicles of all kinds. It'd be one of the greatest military buildups, certainly in American history ever, from being so unprepared to being able to be a dominant force internationally. And so Marshall is going to do that. And interestingly, he has this black book that he carries around. And whenever he's interacting with a soldier, it might be a major somewhere, might be a sergeant somewhere, might even just be a private, but someone who just stands out, catches his eye, he'd write the guy's name down, and then he would keep it in his book. And then the next time he needs, of course, when you're building a massive army of 9 million people, you're going to need a lot of officers. People are going to constantly ask you, well, who could we put here? And he would always refer to that book. So if you wanted to succeed, you wanted to impress him and get in that book. And so he was always looking for talent. And he, to a fault sometimes, would trust his folks to be in. If I put you in charge, I expect you to do your homework and do the job. I'm not going to micromanage. How do you micromanage a 9 million man army, military force?
Yeah.
But there were times when that cost him as well. One of his shortcomings, perhaps, was that the disaster at Pearl Harbor, and there were those who said he was slow to respond. He was not careful enough to be watching and prepared for a Japanese attack. But in his defense, he had trusted the people that were in charge in Pearl Harbor and the admirals and so on out there, and they had given him bad information and slow information, and so. That could have been, a couple of times, some things happened that could have been a disaster for him, but the powers that be liked him and trusted him, and so that kind of saved him. He didn't unnecessarily burn any bridges, and he had some interesting comments. At one point, people were saying to him, later, when he was Secretary of State, people were saying, well, you've got a lot of discouraged people in the ranks here right now. They're a little discouraged. And his comment was, officers don't have I'm not going to go around trying to encourage all the officers. If you're an officer, you're responsible for your own attitude. He said, no one is making my attitude positive. I do that myself. I guard that. I try to be a positive influence on the people I lead. And he said, if you can't, manage your own attitude, then you won't be in my black book for promotion. And so over time, of course, as he's putting all kinds of people into the ranks, he's getting all kinds of people in the military who highly respect him and are grateful to him. So people like Eisenhower, people like Omar Bradley, these are folks that he's going to promote and that ultimately will be top-ranking people. Eisenhower will become the president. And probably in one of his great sort of moments in his career, it's getting time for D-Day and the invasion of Normandy, and basically Marshall's the top military guy in the army, and he has never led an invasion, never led a battle before, and now the greatest amphibious landing invasion in human history, he can command it if he chooses to. But he is a person of high principle, of integrity, and even though he's got the perfect right to say, well, I'm going to personally lead this, he doesn't want to appear like he's using his position to win his own fame. Now, MacArthur would have done that for sure, but Marshall is constantly he's a very controlled sort of person. It's interesting because Franklin Roosevelt was the kind of guy that he would kind of hold court, and he'd have all of his aides and people, and Roosevelt would tell jokes and things, and everybody would ha ha just laugh, the president's latest funny joke. And Marshall made it a point not to laugh at those jokes. He'd kind of be stoic, and he, in his mind, he didn't want to ever look like just someone that was trying to stroke the president's ego, trying to win his favor. He wanted to appear very loyal, but very objective too. That you could always, everyone else might be laughing and grinning and joking around, but Marshall would be the guy with the steady look that when you wanted facts and details and hard truths, you'd ask him, and he'd always tell you what you needed to know. And so he's always tried to just present himself in a way that he's not just one of everybody else. He kind of stands out as that serious person who's done his homework, and he's ready to give you the answer you need to hear. And so now he's got to decide: does he assign himself to the most glorious military role? Like, ultimately, of course, Eisenhower will have that assignment, and Eisenhower will become so famous for leading the invasion into Europe that he'll become the president and serve 2 terms. And so it's a very coveted role, but he just can't bring himself to just appoint himself. So he brings the decision to President Roosevelt and says, Mr. President, I am at your disposal. I will happily lead that invasion if you call me to do that, or I will appoint someone else if you want me to do that. And he leaves it in Roosevelt's hands, and then he waits. And of course, it's the most awesome, coveted military role, perhaps for the Americans in the entire war. And finally, Roosevelt comes back and says, Marshall, I just couldn't sleep at night if you weren't here in Washington, D.C. with me. And so you're going to have to send someone else. And so he appoints Eisenhower to do it instead. And so he misses that opportunity. And he has to groom. Eisenhower is one of his lieutenants, one of the people he's cultivated. And he's going to always be a great support to Eisenhower, always an encouragement to him. And then after finally the war is over, Truman, who of course replaced Roosevelt, he very quickly sizes up Marshall and realizes, of course, Truman prided himself in being a straight talker and that kind of thing. And so he sees Marshall as the kind of guy he can respect. And a lot of people would say that the longer they were around Marshall, the more they respected him. And so Truman will make him ultimately his Secretary of State. And Marshall's one of these guys, you look back later, and of course he doesn't do anything foolish. He's always pretty conservative. But there's some things he'll do that, looking back, you realize he wasn't perfect. And of course he didn't know how the history would turn out. He's got a few things he does that we would second guess today. For instance, when Truman really wanted to recognize Israel as a separate nation, Marshall was actually opposed to that, and basically just said, you've got these millions of Arabs who hate the Jews, and why are we going to kind of partner with the minority? The Arabs have all the oil. We need to side with the people with the oil. And again, it was not necessarily a moral choice. It was just, he was always quite pragmatic. Just let's side with the majority that controls the oil. That's in our interest. And so there were times where he needed to be overruled. Truman overruled him, and he wanted to recognize Israel right away as a nation. And so there were several times like that where Marshall would always just and it was kind of like when Eisenhower and Patton and some of the military forces easily could have captured Berlin before the Russians did. But they had signed an agreement, and even though Patton and others are saying, but it's wide open, we can just go in and take Berlin, he would say, no, we agreed with the Russians that they would, that's part of their territory. And so always would kind of go by the rules, which in most cases was good, but there were times when he also just kind of lacked that bold vision, the daring that others would have used. And of course, the thing that he became famous for ultimately was, after the war, a very bold move, though, for him, which was the Marshall Plan, where I think over $19 billion are given or loaned to the countries to rebuild Europe. And that was, again, a very unorthodox approach, because when you just spent billions of dollars destroying Germany, your enemy, or Japan, you don't turn around then and loan them billions of dollars back to rebuild what you have spent a lot of money to destroy. But their reasoning, but we've got to have people to trade with, to sell our products to, and if they're just a country in ruin now, they can't do business, and who knows what kind of seedbed of anarchy and communism and other things that would rise up there. So, most people don't realize this now, but they actually offered it to the Soviet Union as well. They offered to give Russia money as well to rebuild if they needed it. But of course, that would have been embarrassing to take handouts, even though they really could have used the money. And his biographer says that Russia actually could have, if they wanted to destroy the Marshall Plan, the best way they could have done it is to accept money from them and basically bankrupt the plan. But instead, all the Soviet bloc turned it down. And so, of course, Western Europe and Japan were rebuilt and became very successful modern countries. And people told Truman that because he was the president, that they should call it the Truman Plan. And Truman, in his own modesty, has said, well, a lot of people don't like me. I want them to like this plan, and so let's call it the Marshall Plan. And since Marshall's the one that did the legwork to make this happen, and so could have been the Truman Plan, but Truman was modest enough himself to give credit where it was due. And so Marshall was the kind of guy that after he finishes being Secretary of State, tries to retire, but then they need him to be the Secretary of Defense, and he comes back in, and he was just that kind of reliable person.
Sort of an indispensable lieutenant.
Yeah,
Sounds like.
and when you just want someone you can trust to kind of organize, and the Secretary of Defense that previously had really kind of messed up, not done a very good job, and so Truman he needed someone reliable, and so it's interesting in certain settings, reliable might not be the right person. Sometimes you need dashing, daring, inventive, visionary. But there's always going to be a role for the marshals. One or two last kind of comments about him. He at one point when the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II is going to be coronated as the queen, and so they send Marshall over along with a couple other big dignitaries, and he's walking in, and there were a couple of other high-level Americans who were in attendance as well. Westminster Chapel, as the Queen is going to be for her coronation, and the story is that when Marshall walked in to the chapel to find his seat, that everybody began to stand. Winston Churchill, all these people just began standing, and Marshall turned around and looked to see, like, well, who are they standing for? Who's come in that's famous, and didn't realize they were all standing for him. But Churchill would say that Marshall was one of the greatest men that he'd ever had the privilege of working with, and had great respect for him because of how he built the American military force, and basically came to save Britain and Europe. And at that coronation afterward, there was a banquet. Marshall was the only person who wasn't royalty who was invited to sit at the same table as the Queen. And so we don't even really know a lot about him now, but he was twice Time Magazine voted him Man of the Year. He wins a Nobel Peace Prize. But finally, and he was tired. Of course, if you can imagine all the work that he did. At one point during World War II, there's an interesting story where he was just constantly doing correspondence, giving orders, sorting things out, and General Groves, who was the military person in charge of the whole Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb project, he was the military person overseeing that was overseeing Oppenheimer and those folks. And he came in, and he needed with a signing of a pen, Marshall would give $100 million to the project to keep it going. And so Groves has handed a request to Marshall for him to approve $100 million going into the project to build the atomic bomb. But he's standing respectfully because Marshall is busily writing out some other document, some other check, and finally Marshall gets that done, and he signs the approval for the $100 million, and it just struck Marshall a little funny, and so he said to the general, "General, it might interest you to know what I was doing before I signed this." He said, I was writing a check for $2.39 for grass seed that I need to get for my front lawn. And so the irony to Marshall, at one moment he's authorizing an expenditure of $2.39 to get grass seed for his front yard. And with the next stroke of the pen, $100 million going into building a nuclear bomb. Yeah. And just that kind of power. And yet, I've always kind of liked that story, too, in the sense that even people who lead enormous armies and have enormous responsibility still have the mundane tasks of yard care or family, children, and so on, that everybody else has as well.
Yeah.
And so Marshall finally is allowed to retire for good. He did a couple of different things he would do now and then, but by the time he was done, he was satisfied to be done. And I didn't realize this till I read his biography, but when you're made a 5-star general in the U.S. Army, you're considered always on active duty, even if you kind of retire. If you get paid like a full salary, it's a great gig. I wouldn't mind getting a 5-star general salary.
Yeah.
Because it's a great retirement plan. But it also means that you can be recalled at any moment for counsel or whatever it is that the government feels like you can do. And so that was Marshall. And he, when he finally died, he insisted that there not be a eulogy, that there not be a lot of pomp and circumstance. He was buried in Arlington Cemetery, but right to the very end of his life was determined not to have a lot of fluff and pomp and circumstance, but just to be someone that did his duty, that was reliable, that accomplished the goals, the tasks that were set before him. And so we know a lot more about Eisenhower and MacArthur and a lot of the Roosevelts, a lot of the flashy people that also were operating around the same time. But people like Churchill would have said that's the man who won the war by so raising up the military force in the West and to be able to defeat Germany and Japan. And so it's always a lesson to me. I think sometimes we always think of leadership as the flashy MacArthur, the great orator of Churchill, Roosevelt. But oftentimes it's the leader who's a good manager, in a sense, who just takes what he's given and makes it better and is reliable and makes the people above him successful. And if you can always make the manager, your manager, look good and be successful, a lot of times that means you're going to also have people that are happy to support and promote you in what you're called to do as well.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating life, and appreciate you illuminating his life for us today, Richard.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.